In the heart of a bustling city, where life moved at a fast pace and people were always in a hurry, lived Emma, a woman in her late 30s, with dark brown hair and warm, hazel eyes. She had been married to Robert for 10 years. Their marriage, once filled with passion and laughter, had slowly withered away into a routine of polite conversations and distant affection. Robert, a kind and hard-working man, had been struggling with a chronic illness for the past few years. The illness had taken a toll on his health, and intimacy had become a distant memory for the couple. Emma loved Robert dearly, but she couldn't deny the loneliness that had crept into her heart. The void left by the absence of physical and emotional intimacy was becoming too much to bear. It was during this time that she met David, a charismatic and charming man who worked in the same office building as her. David was also married, but like Emma, he felt trapped in a marriage that had lost its spark. Their encounters started innocently enough, a smile here, a shared joke there. But as days turned into weeks, their connection deepened. They began to share more personal stories, their disappointments, and their unfulfilled desires. Emma felt a spark she hadn't felt in years. David was everything she missed, attentive, caring, and passionate. It wasn't long before their friendship crossed the line into a forbidden affair. They would meet in secret, in hidden corners of the city where they could be alone. The thrill of the secrecy, the stolen moments of passion, and the feeling of being desired again consumed Emma. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. For the first time in years, she felt alive. But as their affair continued, the weight of their actions began to press down on Emma. She was racked with guilt, knowing she was betraying the man who had stood by her side through thick and thin. Robert, oblivious to his wife's secret life, continued to trust her implicitly, making the deception even harder to bear. The affair with David, however, started to unravel. His wife, growing suspicious of his frequent absences, began to ask questions. The excitement that once fueled their encounters was now overshadowed by the constant fear of being discovered. David, fearing the consequences, started to pull away, leaving Emma feeling more isolated than ever. It was during this time that Emma met Lucas, a young, free-spirited man in his late 20s. Lucas was everything David wasn't: spontaneous, adventurous, and unburdened by the responsibilities of marriage. He worked as a travel photographer, living a life full of excitement and unpredictability. He had no ties, no commitments, and he offered Emma a glimpse into a world she had only dreamed of. Lucas was captivated by Emma's beauty and the sadness that lingered behind her eyes. He pursued her with a youthful intensity, offering her an escape from the life that had become a prison. For Emma, Lucas represented freedom, a chance to start over and leave behind the guilt and regret that had consumed her. In a moment of recklessness, Emma decided to run away with Lucas. She left a note for Robert, apologizing for her actions, but explaining that she needed to find herself again. She didn't mention David, knowing that the truth would only cause more pain. Emma and Lucas disappeared together, leaving behind the life she had known. They traveled from city to city, living in the moment and embracing the uncertainty of their new life. But as time passed, the reality of what she had done began to weigh heavily on Emma. She missed the stability and comfort of her old life, the love she once shared with Robert, and the sense of belonging she had lost. One night, as they sat on a beach watching the sunset, Lucas noticed the sadness in Emma's eyes. "Are you happy, Emma?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emma looked out at the horizon, the waves crashing against the shore. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "I thought this was what I wanted, but now I'm not so sure." Lucas took her hand in his grip firm but understanding. "You can't run from your past forever, Emma. Maybe it's time to face it." Emma nodded, realizing that she couldn't keep running. She needed to confront the choices she had made and the people she had hurt. The next day, she booked a ticket back to the city, leaving Lucas behind with a promise to stay in touch. When Emma returned, she found Robert waiting for her. He looked older, more fragile, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I've missed you," he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. Emma broke down, tears streaming down her face as she confessed everything: the affair with David, running away with Lucas, and the emptiness that had driven her to make those choices. Robert listened quietly, his face pale, but his eyes remained kind. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "I never wanted to hurt you." Robert reached out and took her hand, his grip weak but steady. "We've both made mistakes," he said gently. "But I still love you, Emma. If you're willing, we can try to rebuild what we lost." Emma looked at him, her heart heavy with guilt and sorrow, but also with a glimmer of hope. "I'd like that," she whispered. And so, they began the slow, painful process of healing. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the wounds felt too deep to ever fully heal. But they were committed to trying, to finding their way back to each other. Months had passed since Emma returned home to Robert. The path to reconciliation was rocky, filled with emotional landmines and nights of restless sleep. But both of them were committed to the healing process, taking each day as it came. They attended counseling together, a neutral ground where they could express their fears, frustrations, and hopes for the future. Slowly, they began to rediscover the bond they once had. But the past has a way of lingering, and Emma couldn't entirely shake off the memories of her time with David and Lucas. The affair with David, in particular, weighed heavily on her conscience. She knew she had broken a sacred trust, and though Robert had chosen to forgive her, the guilt gnawed at her, reminding her of her betrayal. One evening, while Emma was cleaning out the attic, She came across an old box of letters and photographs. Among them was a picture of her and Robert from their early days of dating. They looked so happy, carefree, and deeply in love. She traced her fingers over the image, feeling a pang of nostalgia for the simpler times. But as she dug deeper into the box, she found a folded note in Robert's handwriting. Her heart pounded as she opened it. The note was dated shortly after she had left with Lucas. It was a letter Robert had written but never sent. It read, "Dear Emma, I've spent hours trying to understand what happened, where we went wrong. I know I'm not the man I used to be, and I'm sorry for how my illness has affected our lives. You didn't sign up for this, and I can't blame you for wanting more. I only wish I could have been the one to give it to you. If you found happiness with someone else, I won't stand in your way. But if there's any part of you that still loves me, even just a little, I want you to know that I'm here, waiting. I'm willing to fight for us, but only if you want to fight too. Love, Robert." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she read the letter. Robert had been more aware of her feelings than she'd realized, and the fact that he was willing to let her go if it meant her happiness broke her heart all over again. She knew she had to make things right, not just with Robert, but with herself. That night, Emma made a decision. She needed to confront her past, not just with Robert, but with David as well. The next morning, she called David and asked to meet him. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city, away from prying eyes. When Emma arrived, David was already there, sitting at a corner table. He looked the same as she remembered, though there was a hint of unease in his expression. They exchanged pleasantries, and after the initial awkwardness faded, Emma got straight to the point. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, her voice steady. "About us, about what happened." David nodded, his eyes fixed on her. "So have I," he admitted. "I'm sorry for how things ended, Emma. I never meant to hurt you or my wife. I was just lost." "We both were," Emma replied softly. "But what we did, it wasn't right. It was selfish, and it hurt a lot of people." David looked down, guilt etched on his face. "I know. I've been trying to make things right with my wife, but it's hard. She found out about the affair, and it's been difficult." Emma felt a pang of sympathy for David's wife, a woman she had never met but whose life she had helped to upend. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely. "I hope you both can find a way to move forward." David looked at her, his expression a mix of regret and resignation. "What about you, Emma? Are you okay?" Emma thought about Robert, about the journey they were on together, and she nodded. "I'm getting there. Robert and I are working on things, and it's not easy, but I think we have a chance." "I'm glad," David said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You deserve to be happy, Emma." "So do you," she replied. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. Finally, Emma stood up. I think it's time we let go of the past, David. We can't change what happened, but we can learn from it and be better. David nodded, standing as well. You're right. I wish you all the best, Emma. And I wish the same for you, she said, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. They parted ways outside the cafe, and as Emma walked away, she felt a sense of closure. The chapter with David was finally over, and she was ready to focus on the future. Back at home, Robert was waiting for her. He looked up from the book he was reading, his eyes filled with the quiet love that had never wavered. Emma walked over to him and took his hand, squeezing it gently. I'm here, Robert, she said, her voice full of emotion. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Robert smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. I'm glad, he whispered, pulling her into a warm embrace. As they held each other, Emma knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face it with Robert by her side. The shadows of her past were finally beginning to fade, and in their place, a new dawn was breaking, one filled with hope, forgiveness, and the possibility of a brighter future. Emma had always prided herself on her ability to resist temptation. She was a woman of strong morals, deeply committed to her husband, Robert, despite the challenges they faced. But there was something about David, his magnetic charm, the way he looked at her with those piercing blue eyes, that made her feel alive again, something she hadn't felt in years. It started innocently, as these things often do. Emma and David would meet for coffee after work, exchanging stories about their lives, their frustrations, and their dreams. David was an attentive listener, and Emma found herself drawn to his easygoing nature and the way he seemed to understand her without judgment. One evening, after a particularly stressful day at the office, David suggested they grab a drink at a nearby bar. It was a cozy place, dimly lit, with soft jazz playing in the background. They sat in a corner booth, tucked away from the rest of the patrons. As they talked, the conversation shifted from work to more personal topics: marriage, love, and the growing emptiness in their respective relationships. David reached across the table, placing his hand on Emma's. His touch was warm, comforting, and electric all at once. Emma looked down at their hands, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she should pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she looked up into David's eyes and saw a reflection of her own loneliness. I've missed this, David said softly, his voice tinged with sadness. Just being close to someone who understands. Emma swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. Me too, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Before she could second-guess herself, David leaned in, closing the distance between them. His lips brushed against hers, tentative at first, but then with a growing hunger that matched the desire she had been suppressing for so long. Emma's heart raced as she kissed him back, the sensation both thrilling and terrifying. They broke apart, breathless and staring at each other with a mixture of shock and yearning. "Emma," David began, his voice hoarse, "we don't have to do this. We can stop now." But Emma knew she was already past the point of no return. The walls she had carefully built around her heart had crumbled, and all she could think about was the need to feel desired again, to feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't want to stop." David's eyes darkened with desire as he took her hand and led her out of the bar. They walked in silence to a nearby hotel, the air between them thick with anticipation. Emma's mind raced, a whirl of thoughts and emotions, but she couldn't bring herself to turn back. In the privacy of the hotel room, the tension that had been building between them finally snapped. David pulled Emma into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her knees weak. She responded with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair as she pressed herself against him. They moved together with a sense of urgency, as if trying to make up for all the time they had spent denying their feelings. Emma felt a rush of adrenaline as David's hands roamed over her body, awakening sensations she thought she had forgotten. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just the raw, undeniable pull of desire. Clothes were discarded hastily, leaving a trail from the door to the bed. Emma gasped as David's lips traced a path down her neck, his hands exploring every curve of her body with a reverence that made her shiver. She had never felt so wanted, so completely consumed by another person. As they tumbled onto the bed, their bodies entwined, Emma let herself get lost in the moment. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the here and now, the feel of David's skin against hers, the way he whispered her name like a prayer. She clung to him, desperate to hold onto the fleeting sense of euphoria, to forget the reality waiting for her on the other side of the door. The intimacy they shared was intense, electric, and unlike anything Emma had experienced in years. It was a heady mix of passion and forbidden pleasure, a dangerous cocktail that left her craving more even as she knew it was wrong. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, the air between them heavy with the aftermath of their actions. Emma stared at the ceiling, her mind a chaotic mess of emotions. Guilt gnawed at the edges of her consciousness, but it was overshadowed by the satisfaction of finally feeling connected to someone in a way she had been missing for so long. David turned to her, his expression tender as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Emma nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was being entirely honest. "I'm fine," she replied, forcing a smile. But as they lay there in the fading light, reality began to creep back in. Emma knew she couldn't keep this up forever. The affair with David was a temporary escape, a bandage over the deeper wounds in her life. She was playing with fire, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. For now, though, she pushed those thoughts aside, allowing herself to enjoy the moment for what it was, a brief reprieve from the emptiness she had felt for so long. But deep down, Emma knew that this was just the beginning of a path that could lead to heartbreak and destruction, a path she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Emma slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake David. She dressed quickly, her mind already racing with excuses for where she had been. As she left the hotel room, she glanced back at David, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the turmoil that was brewing inside her. Emma walked out into the cool morning air, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, one that could cost her everything if she wasn't careful. But as she headed back to the life she had temporarily escaped, she couldn't shake the feeling that a part of her was already too far gone to turn back. The affair with David was like a drug for Emma, a potent mix of passion, secrecy, and the thrill of the forbidden. Each stolen moment with him was a reprieve from the dullness of her life, a temporary escape from the responsibilities and the gnawing guilt she carried every day. They met whenever they could, always careful to avoid detection, their encounters growing more frequent and intense as time went on. Emma's life became a delicate balancing act. She would spend her days with Robert, going through the motions of a marriage that had lost its spark, all the while knowing that her heart and body were being drawn deeper into her clandestine relationship with David. The guilt was always there, lurking in the background, but she pushed it down, rationalizing her actions as a way to cope with the loneliness that had consumed her for so long. But the more time Emma spent with David, the more complicated things became. Their encounters, once filled with the excitement of new love, began to take on a darker, more obsessive tone. David became possessive, wanting more of her time, more of her attention. He would text her constantly, asking where she was, what she was doing, and when they could meet again. Emma found herself caught in a web of lies, making excuses to Robert, to her friends, and even to herself. One afternoon, after a particularly intense meeting with David, Emma sat in her car, her hands trembling as she clutched the steering wheel. She had just spent 2 hours in a hotel room with him, their passions so consuming that she had lost track of time. Now, she was late for a dinner with Robert, and the reality of her actions was starting to catch up with her. As she drove home, Emma's mind raced with thoughts of how she could explain her absence. She had become so adept at lying, at fabricating stories to cover her tracks, but each lie added another layer of guilt to the heavy burden she carried. She knew she couldn't keep this up forever. Something had to give. When Emma arrived home, Robert was already waiting for her, his face etched with concern. "You're late," he said softly, his eyes searching hers for an explanation. "I'm sorry," Emma replied, forcing a smile as she leaned in to kiss him on the cheek. "Work ran late, and then there was traffic." Robert nodded, accepting her excuse, but Emma could see the doubt in his eyes. She knew he wasn't completely convinced, but he didn't press her for more details. Instead, he took her hand and led her to the dining room, where dinner was already laid out on the table. As they ate in silence, Emma couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt every time Robert looked at her with those trusting eyes. She had once loved him so deeply, had vowed to be faithful to him for the rest of their lives. But now, here she was, betraying that trust with every secret rendezvous with David. That night, as she lay in bed next to Robert, Emma's thoughts turned to the future. She knew she couldn't continue living this double life. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But the thought of ending things with David filled her with a sense of dread. He had become so much more than just a lover. He was her confidant, her escape, the one person who made her feel alive again. The next morning, Emma woke early, her mind made up. She needed to confront David, to find a way to end the affair before it destroyed everything she held dear. She sent him a text, asking to meet at their usual spot, a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. When she arrived, David was already there, sitting in a corner booth, his expression unreadable. As she slid into the seat across from him, he reached out to take her hand, but Emma pulled away, her resolve firm. "David, we need to talk," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. David frowned, his eyes narrowing. "What's going on, Emma? You're acting strange." Emma took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. Thus, it has to stop," she said, her heart pounding in her chest. "I can't keep living like this, lying to Robert, to myself. It's tearing me apart." David's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "What are you saying? Are you ending this?" Emma nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I have to, David. I can't keep hurting Robert like this. He doesn't deserve it." David's grip on the edge of the table tightened, his knuckles turning white. "And what about us? What about what we have?" "What we have isn't real," Emma said, her voice cracking. "It's a fantasy, an escape. But it's not sustainable, and it's not fair to anyone involved." David's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, Emma was afraid of what he might do. But then, just as quickly, the anger was replaced with sadness, a deep, aching sorrow that mirrored her own. "I love you, Emma," he whispered, his voice filled with desperation. "I don't want to lose you." Emma's heart broke at his words, but she knew what she had to do. "I care about you too, David. This isn't love. It's not the kind of love that builds a life. It's something else, something that can only lead to pain." David stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt. But Emma held firm, her resolve unwavering. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "If this is what you really want," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "then I won't fight you." but just know that I'll never forget what we had." Emma nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks as she stood up from the table. "I'll never forget either," she said softly. "But it's time to move on." As she walked out of the cafe, Emma felt a mix of relief and heartbreak. She knew she had done the right thing, but the pain of ending things with David was almost unbearable. She had grown to care for him deeply, and the thought of never seeing him again filled her with a sense of loss. But as she drove home, Emma reminded herself of what was truly important. She had made a commitment to Robert, a commitment she had strayed from but was now determined to honor. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face it, ready to rebuild her marriage and heal the wounds she had inflicted on herself and those she loved. When she walked through the front door, Robert was waiting for her, a concerned look on his face. Emma took a deep breath and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. "I'm here, Robert," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." As Robert held her close, Emma knew that she had made the right choice. The affair with David was over, but the lessons she had learned from it would stay with her forever. She had strayed from her path, but now she was determined to find her way back, to rebuild her life and her marriage with the man who had always been there for her. And as she stood there, wrapped in Robert's arms, Emma felt a sense of peace for the first time in a long time. The affair was over, but her journey was just beginning. Emma's decision to end the affair with David was the beginning of a long and arduous journey back to herself and to Robert. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of relief, guilt, and a deep sense of loss. Ending the affair was like severing a limb. It was necessary, but it left her feeling incomplete, wounded. Robert sensed the change in Emma, even though she hadn't yet told him everything. He noticed how she was more present, more attentive, but also how she seemed haunted by something just beneath the surface. One evening, after a quiet dinner, he finally confronted her. "Emma," he said softly, sitting down beside her on the couch. "I know something's been bothering you. I've noticed it for a while now. I want you to know that whatever it is, we can get through it together." Emma looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of the truth she had been carrying. She knew she couldn't keep it from him any longer. It was time to lay everything out in the open, no matter how painful it might be. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "Robert, there's something I need to tell you. It's not easy, and it's something I'm deeply ashamed of, but you deserve to know the truth." Robert's expression remained calm, though she could see the worry in his eyes. "Whatever it is, Emma, we'll face it together." Emma's voice trembled as she confessed everything: her affair with David, the lies, the deceit, and how she had finally ended it because she realized she couldn't continue living that way. She spoke without holding back, letting the tears flow freely as she recounted the mistakes she had made. When she finished, There was a long, heavy silence between them. Robert's face was pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and sadness. For a moment, Emma feared he would walk away, that this would be the end of their marriage. But then, slowly, Robert reached out and took her hand. "I'm not going to lie, Emma," he said quietly, his voice strained. "This hurts more than I can put into words. But I'm glad you told me. I'm glad you had the courage to come clean." Emma squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Robert. I never wanted to hurt you. I was lost, and I made terrible choices. But I want to make things right. I want to rebuild what we had." Robert looked into her eyes, searching for the truth in her words. "It's going to take time, Emma," he said finally. "A lot of time. But if you're willing to put in the work, so am I. I love you, and I want us to get through this." Emma nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. "I'm willing, Robert. I want to fight for us, for our marriage." The days and weeks that followed were filled with difficult conversations, therapy sessions, and a renewed commitment to each other. It wasn't easy. There were moments of anger, pain, and doubt, but they faced them together, determined to heal the wounds that had been inflicted on their relationship. Emma knew that rebuilding trust would be the hardest part. Robert was patient, but there were times when the scars of her betrayal would resurface, casting a shadow over their progress. But they continued to move forward, taking small steps toward healing and forgiveness. As the months passed, Emma and Robert began to rediscover the love that had brought them together in the first place. They made an effort to spend more time together, to communicate openly and honestly, and to find new ways to connect emotionally and physically. Slowly, the distance between them began to close. One evening, nearly a year after Emma had ended the affair, they found themselves sitting on the porch of their home, watching the sunset. The air was warm, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. It was a moment of quiet peace, one that they had both worked so hard to achieve. "I never thought we'd make it here," Robert said, his voice soft as he reached for Emma's hand. "Neither did I," Emma admitted, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But I'm so glad we did." Robert turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "We've been through a lot, but I believe we're stronger because of it. I love you, Emma. I always have, and I always will." Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy. "I love you too, Robert," she whispered, leaning in to kiss him gently. As they sat together, the sun dipping below the horizon, Emma felt a sense of peace and contentment that she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced her darkest fears, confronted her mistakes, and found her way back to the man she loved. Their journey wasn't over, but they were on the right path, walking it together, hand in hand. And for the first time in a long time, Emma felt hopeful about the future because she knew that no matter what came their way, they would face it together, stronger than ever before. And so, as the night descended around them, Emma and Robert sat side by side, ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that they had overcome the shadows of the past and emerged into the light together.